So today we're going to look at Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes as part of your Power and Conflict anthology for poetry. So the first thing we're going to look at is the message of the poem. So the message of the poem essentially says how war is pointless. It talks about the inexplicable horror of war as well. It also shows the cyclical nature of war and how war is continuing. There's no real end in sight, as well as propaganda and patriotism also being pointless, and how by the end of the poem the soldier is confused, scared, and disorientated. The next thing we'll talk about is the context. So Ted Hughes actually learned about World War II by listening to stories when he was a child, and this poem was written in 1957, which is a bit different as it's more of a retrospective viewpoint, whereas poems such as Exposure by Wilfred Owen is a personal account. This is a story about the war. So it's a different interpretation, which is always good to know. Then on to the themes. So obviously got power and conflict, and power is used a lot when with the propaganda and the government and how the government let them down. Lots of conflict to do with the war. Fear and confusion are also very much present within this poem. So let's go to the poem itself. So language. Here's our first quotation. The first quotation is actually the very first line of the poem. Suddenly he awoke and running raw. So the word suddenly is an adverb. It drops us into the poem as if it's hyper-real, breaking the days when the soldier was asleep. It makes the reader just as confused as the soldier in the poem. He suddenly awoke, have no idea what's going on, and just running through the field, just as the reader is suddenly dropped into the poem, having no idea what's going on. You then have the word raw, and the raw is a really interesting word. It's an adjective. Shows flesh being exposed, having pain and suffering. And this is a really good word as it almost suggests that the soldier is exposed to. He's exposed to the war, to the elements, to the nature around him, having nothing really by his side. He's raw, he's exposed, he's out there with the elements. And this lovely image is supposed to be of a man running. To help you remember your quotes, I'm guessing you're probably better artists than I am, but that is supposed to be someone running to help you remember how he's suddenly running as he wakes up. So the second quote we're going to look at is threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame. And this is a really important quotation. First of all, it's a simile to get your method mark. And the first thing we're going to look at is throw up. So throw up is a very violent expression, almost as if the ground vomited up the hair. And this can kind of, you could argue, also resonates with the soldiers and how they've sort of become sick of this war, not only mentally but physically sick about the war and everything which is associated around it. The word yellow also sort of backs up, saying how the word yellow has connotations of disease and illness, and how war is a disease on man as well as nature. A hare is an innocent animal, almost like a big version of a rabbit. Again, it's an innocent creature which has been set alight, and the fact that it was rolled like a flame. If you're set on fire, not only is it an inevitable death, it's a gory and gruesome and a violent death, and pretty much that shows the fate of each of the soldiers running on this field. Looking at our images, this is my lovely image of the hair on fire. Quite an easy one to remember, as it's a very weird image. So that's a really good quote for you to know for your poem. And the third quotation we're going to look at is king, honour, human dignity, etc. This is a really important quote, especially looking at the use of power. So talk about the word king, showing the person in charge and how he's pointless essentially to these soldiers now, to how propaganda have failed him. The next word we're going to look at is the word etc. And when you talk about saying something etc, you're saying it's pointless, nonchalant, it's continuing to fail them, and how the conflict of the war will never end. King, honour, human dignity, etc. It's as if, what's the point anymore? There's nothing good in the world anymore, and how war is just continuing and continuing on, and how there's no end in sight. What is the point of having kings and honour and human dignity if we have war? That's essentially what this quotation is saying. And for my little image, I've got crown is supposed to be, with the word etc. in there, so very imaginative. We're now going to look at the structure of the poems. The poem has 3 stanzas, quite a short poem. There's no rhyme scheme. However, there's a lot of enjambment, and enjambment is when the lines continue on from one to the next without any punctuation. And this sort of shows the continuing and sort of cyclical nature of the war and how it's continuing with no end in sight. So a very, very happy poem overall, I think you can agree. And the poems where we can compare it to our exposure, talking about the power of nature and how nature can be an enemy but also a victim in war. We've also got Charge of the Light Brigade, talking about power and how the government within Charge of the Light Brigade gave the wrong orders to the men, forcing them to die, just as in Bayonet Charge, the use of patriotism and propaganda also failed them, making the men inevitably die. So chirpy. And then Ozymandias talk about how men will fall and how men will inevitably fail. The same thing with Bayonet Charge. The soldier at the end, there's no real ending. It continues on. He's continuing running through this field of hell, and how, again, it is inevitable that he will be doomed. So that was a nice little whistle-stop tour of Bayonet Charge, a very, very happy poem for everyone to write about in Power and Conflicts.